Hi, everyone. So as Sarah mentioned, my talk today will be about how to convince your colleagues in a larger organization to use lean startup methods. And so first, I want to give you a little bit of background about who I am. I manage a small data team in Google AdSense's sales and marketing group. And obviously, Google is a large company, and there's a lot of work happening across the board that I'm not fully familiar with. So what I'll be talking about today doesn't necessarily reflect any sort of broader trends or attitudes or endorsements of lean startup. This is more about my own personal experience, trying to convince my colleagues and the realizations that I've had as I've been doing that in my own immediate organization. And so with that, I'd like to start with the challenge that brought me here today. So a few months ago, I was in an AdSense manager's meeting, and we were discussing funding a lot of new projects. These were big projects in new business areas. And because of that, we didn't have a lot of the historical data that we like to have to base decisions on. And my management team's a pretty data-driven group. And so for them, not having a lot of info made them feel uncomfortable about making aggressive investment decisions. So these are projects where we needed to provide funding and headcount for. And so actually, during this process, we actually didn't really provide funding to many of the projects. And around the same time, I also had a conversation with my smaller, more immediate team. And this was a group that had great ideas for projects. But at Google, we have the ability to scale our projects at a large level by reaching out to many customers at once. And so it was often tempting for them to do exactly that, to reach out to customers early on, lots of them, and to work with their regional counterparts and their functional liaisons to get everyone on the same page and start trying to get that impact early on in the process. But after doing all of that work, sometimes a project wouldn't work out. And that was super frustrating for people. And so they actually came to me asking for help in overcoming this challenge. And as I was thinking about how to help, I happened to read the Lean Startup book. And I was really impressed. It exactly addressed the kinds of challenges that my organization was facing. And it put forward a clear philosophy about how to overcome those challenges. And so I was starting to think, how can I get everyone in my organization to start adopting these principles? And I started to think about taking the traditional approaches that I could in a larger organization. I thought about going to my management team, telling them, hey, I read this book and I think it's great, and I think you all should read it and start living it. I thought about doing a larger 1 or 2 hour formal training to my broader organization, walking them through the principles. But as I was thinking about these kinds of approaches, I realized that the material in the book wasn't specific enough to really help me carry out this philosophy within my organization. And that's understandable. My organization, just like yours, has a bunch of very unique challenges and practices. And we really hadn't done the job yet to figure out how to operationalize lean startup within that context. And we didn't really have, I didn't feel like the big top-down splashy approach was really the right forum to have the kinds of low-level, in-depth conversations we needed to have to figure out what lean startup meant for us. So instead, I wanted to take a very different approach. Instead of going big, I thought I should go small. And I went back to the team that had approached me with asking for help about how to scale their projects. And this was a group that could actually comfortably fit inside a conference room and really debate and talk through the ideas and figure out what it meant in the context of our own projects. And so when I came to the team, I acknowledged to them that I didn't have all the answers. I read this book and it seemed really relevant to our issues, but I wasn't sure exactly about how to apply them. And that's where we all needed to come together and figure that out. And I think doing that gave us all a common purpose. It put us on equal footing, and it meant that they were on board right away, engaging with me in this process. It wasn't me coming to them out of the blue with a request to read some book they'd never heard of. This was me helping them with a problem that they came to me with. It also meant that I was comfortable doing everything I could to help them have a meaningful conversation. So I actually did a few things. I bought the books for everyone. I actually scheduled time on people's work calendars to read the books. I designated an area in our office to read the books. I read the book with people, even though I read the book only a week before. I did a lot. And the reason why is because everyone's busy, and it's really easy to say that you'll do something, even if you want to, and let the rest of work get in the way of getting through that task. And so I wanted to do what I could to let people overcome those natural barriers. And during this period, I also did something. I scheduled a bunch of meetings with people to actually talk about the material as we were reading it. And all this, I have to admit, felt a little aggressive. But as I was doing, I had to remind myself that they had come to me with a problem, and because of that, what I was doing was actually meant to be helpful to them, not pushy. And a big challenge as we were having our conversations was getting people to be concrete, to actually talk about the material in the context of their own projects. And so this is what I really pushed people to do as we talked. And one way I did that is I actually created a mini reading guide that I gave to them as we were reading the material. And in this reading guide, I posed pretty standard lean startup questions, things like, who are your target customers? What are their main problems? What are some assumptions that you might have about them? How could you test these assumptions? These are things that actually seem sort of simple in the abstract, but once you start posing them to people in the context of their own projects, they quickly realize that it's not so straightforward. But this is where having a group together is really helpful, because a group can help each other identify those blind spots that you might experience. Everyone's really great at identifying other people's assumptions. And so as we were working together, trying to ground the concepts in our own work, this is when we started to see patterns. For example, my working group works with online publishers and developers to help them grow their business. And we realized over time, as we were trying to apply the principles in our projects, that there were 3 consistent hypotheses that we needed to validate in order for a project to be worthwhile in our context. So number 1, there needed to be an action that a partner could take that could grow the revenue. We needed to validate that that existed. Number 2, there needed to be some trouble or difficulty that our partners had in taking that action. That was another thing that we needed to specifically validate. Number 3, we needed to validate a solution that could help that target set of partners overcome that problem that they were experiencing taking that action. So this might sound a little straightforward and simple to you now, but it actually took us many months to realize that these were things that were hands down across the board, things that we consistently needed to do. And once we had that realization, now we were in a position to start to concretize these ideas. And one way that we did that was put templates together to actually help people think through their hypotheses and put together MVPs. So I wanted to walk through one example of one template that we used to help people think about their partner problem hypothesis. So before I get into the exact structure of it, I just want to let you know it also took us many iterations to arrive at what you're about to see here. And if you're familiar with the Javelin experiment board, this actually borrows a little bit from that. The main point of a template like this is to get people to take all the information and ideas and abstract concepts they have in their head and actually articulate it and get it out on paper so they can start to interact with the ideas and concepts. So we actually ask people to write out their hypothesis, and we actually write the words for them for the most part. I hypothesize that my target partner might have difficulty doing X behavior because. And the reason why we actually ended up writing out the words is because otherwise, if you just ask someone to create a hypothesis, they're tempted to create it from the perspective of themselves or the perspective of the company, rather than from the perspective of the customer, which is what we want people to do. We also had a section devoted to helping people articulate their main assumptions. Again, people have all these ideas in their head, and once they start to put them on paper, they realize, oh, there's some more assumptions that I wasn't thinking about. And sometimes people needed help thinking, what are assumptions? So we try to define that for people as well. And then once you've identified a few critical assumptions, we want people to structure that test that they're going to use to validate or invalidate some of those assumptions. So X% of partners that I talk to or survey or assess or pitch have to demonstrate something that's consistent with that assumption. We want people to actually write out that sentence. And once they've done the work and talked to their customers, we want to give them a section where we can actually have them lay out what they found. So some percentage of the partners I talked to either met or didn't meet my MVP goal. I was able to validate or invalidate certain assumptions. I think I might need to refine my target problem or my target partner, and so on. And if they were able to validate their assumptions, now and only now was it time to think about the possible solution to this problem that we just validated. So after a while, my role became more about partnering with people on their specific projects, helping them think through their MVPs, their assumptions, helping them structure their thinking. And doing all this for months gave me practice in obviously doing Lean Startup, but also identifying areas where people that I was working with were having trouble. For instance, people often needed help thinking about how to create control groups. They needed help to think about what the appropriate sample size was. And so as I started to recognize this happening over and over again, I was able to develop mini trainings to help people with these to help people overcome these kind of challenges. So I put together resources I could share on an ad hoc basis with people. And after many months of doing this, about 6 months to be exact, we had run over 30 experiments in my own immediate group. And this was a really great feeling. At this point, my group was able to have the data to actually show the impact of things that they were trying. And whether or not they should scale something was actually very clear, because either it was providing some impact or it wasn't. And then slowly, people did for sure invalidate their assumptions often and hypotheses, but people felt good about that too, because they realized that they were saving themselves from future work that ultimately wouldn't have driven any value, and that they were saving their customers from something that they didn't want. And over time, as we were doing this work, something else started to happen. People on my team started talking about their work with people on other teams, and I started to hear about experiments that other groups were running that I had never spoken to about Lean Startup before. I started hearing people use the words hypothesis and experiment in everyday conversation. And so this gave me some validation that, okay, maybe now we're ready to start thinking about how to broaden this out a little bit more beyond my immediate team. I finally felt comfortable actually thinking about how to roll things out more broadly. And now I had a set of concrete actions that made sense within the context of my own working group that I could share with people. I had a set of resources that I could help them overcome the kinds of challenges that I knew people were experiencing in my group. And then most importantly, I also had evidence of people within my group taking this approach that I could point to as social proof that, yes, you too can do this. We've all been able to do this. So as we've been thinking about how to roll Lean Startup more broadly out in my organization, I have to say we're definitely not going to take still the 1-hour training approach, the big top-down thing. If one thing has been clear, it's been that we need to engage with people in a low-level, kind of project-level context in order to help them think about how to apply the material. And so we've talked about putting together a sort of mini incubator, to sort of emulate the kinds of things that I've been talking about here, giving people the opportunity to discuss in a group their hypotheses, their assumptions, and get feedback about that. So as you can see, we're still definitely nowhere near the end. I think we're probably still closer to the beginning. But we have learned a lot along the way, and so I hope what I've shared with you has been helpful. Thanks.